My name is Rosario, and I come from a town near the Mixteca region in Oaxaca. I want to share what I lived through so that others can understand just how far envy and ill intentions can go. I am 28 years old now, but when it all began, I was just a young woman who trusted in the goodness of people. As a girl, I lived in a humble house surrounded by hills and dirt roads. At 18, I met Adrian, a guy a little older than me from a neighboring ranch. He worked selling fruits and vegetables at a local flea market with his dad, Don Aurelio. He was cheerful and respectful, so my parents accepted our relationship. Soon after, I became pregnant, and we got married. We did it with the dream of building a simple but decent home. My in-laws gave us a piece of land, about 15 by 20 meters, where we built 2 small rooms of adobe and tin sheets. One would serve as our home, and the other would become a small grocery store. The little we had, we invested in basic merchandise: rice, beans, sugar, some soft drinks, and cleaning products. Even so, we were excited to see the little store half-stocked. People from the town sometimes preferred to go to the municipal market, but others started coming to us because it was closer or because they liked us. Adrian used to say that with good treatment, the business would grow. And it did. Our son was born, and we named him Mateo. At first, he slept in an improvised crib inside the same room where we had the bed and an old TV. We ate outside, on a wood-fired stove, because there wasn't enough space or an exhaust vent in the room. But we felt happy. Adrian was a hard worker, always making sure we lacked nothing. As the months passed, the little store improved. We added oil, soap, cans of chilies, and even candy for the children. Sales grew. We managed to put up a small hand-painted wooden sign so people would know they could find a little bit of everything there. We even began to afford small luxuries, a meal at the diner downtown or an occasional trip to the city to clear our minds. My father-in-law congratulated us, and I felt very proud to see Adrian fulfilling his promise to give me a decent life. However, in small towns, the prosperity of others can awaken envy. Several neighbors came asking for merchandise on credit, but Adrian repeated what his father had taught him: if you give credit, you'll never see that money again. So we held on to our livelihood. One time, a woman named Dona Clara, around 50 years old, opened a little stand almost identical to ours on the same street. It was said that her son Camilo used drugs and would extort her, taking her money and merchandise. Soon enough, the poor woman was left with nothing. Her business failed, she lost customers, and her son stole whatever he could. After closing down, Dona Clara started wandering the streets asking for help or food. One afternoon, she stopped in front of our store. Her clothes were dirty, her hair unkempt. She asked me for some eggs and a kilo of beans, saying she didn't have a cent and hadn't eaten since the day before. She moved me. Remembering the rule of not giving credit, I reluctantly told her I couldn't. She made a gesture of rage and replied with disdain, "Oh, I see how you are. I hope life makes you pay for your lack of compassion." It felt like a threat, but I said nothing. When Adrian returned, I told him about it, and he said not to worry. However, 2 days later, we found a chicken's head in front of the store door, covered in blood and surrounded by a dark powder. We both looked at each other, not knowing what to do. In the region, many people believe in witchcraft. I wasn't very superstitious, but that discovery chilled my heart. Adrian picked up the head with a bag and threw it far away, trying to downplay the matter. Still, I felt something bad was coming. Soon after, other strange things appeared: a jar with red liquids and pieces of meat from who knows what, wrapped in black rags. I started having nightmares, dreaming that someone entered our room at night and approached Mateo's crib. I would wake up sweating, my heart about to burst out of my chest. Adrian insisted they were hallucinations caused by my fear, but I noticed he himself seemed uneasy. Shortly after, Adrian began to get sick. He said he felt weak, that he lacked the strength to move boxes he used to carry without effort. One morning, he dropped a package of sodas and doubled over in pain. I thought about taking him to the doctor, but we didn't have enough money for consultations, and he refused to spend it on that. Meanwhile, the little store began to feel the change. Adrian, distracted, would make mistakes with the change and give away merchandise without realizing it. Some neighbors returned the extra change, others took advantage of the error. I decided to take charge of the store to avoid losing more income. I made him rest, assuming that with rest he would recover. But his health got worse. He started talking to himself, mixing phrases about the end of the world with others about the price of beans. I got scared and asked my in-laws for help. They told me they didn't know what was happening, that Adrian had always been very healthy. Even so, they sent Cassandra, Adrian's older sister, to help me in the store so I could take care of my husband and the baby. The worst part was that the clientele suddenly disappeared. It seemed like people were afraid of the store, as if we spoke an unknown language. I spent all day behind the counter, and sometimes I only sold 1 or 2 things. To restock the little inventory we had, I had to look for more expensive suppliers. The money was running out, and my husband kept getting worse. He reached the point of waking up at night screaming, his eyes bulging, believing someone was chasing him. He begged me not to leave him alone, that shadows were threatening him. I began to believe that it was indeed a matter of some powerful witchcraft. Although I didn't like the idea of going to healers, I saw no other way out. One afternoon, I asked Cassandra to stay and watch the house while my friend Ramona accompanied me to the house of Dona Yolanda, a trusted healer who lived on the other side of the river. We walked almost an hour until we reached her humble dwelling, full of plants. I told her everything simply. The chicken head, the jar, the visions, the radical changes in Adrian. She looked at me with concern. She took my hand and murmured a prayer I didn't understand. Then she said, "Child, what you have on you is a evil curse. There are people who can't stand to see others progress and they cast curses. Your husband is very damaged. We'll have to do a strong cleansing." She prepared an amulet with herbs and seeds and gave it to me to hang on the store door. She also gave me a scapular for Adrian and asked me to sprinkle him with holy water every night. She told me to pray with faith, that the path would be difficult. She didn't charge me anything and wished me luck. I returned feeling relieved, with hope that things would get better. But when I reached our block, I found several neighbors gathered outside. Some were shouting, others seemed scared. I saw a police patrol and noticed Adrian on the ground, bleeding and handcuffed. Cassandra was crying inconsolably. I ran to ask what was happening. At first, they wouldn't let me near, but I managed to hear Cassandra whisper, "He went into the room. Mateo," he screamed. My skin crawled. I entered the house as best I could, and my worst nightmare became reality. I saw my little boy's body on the floor, motionless. He wasn't breathing. I tried to scream, but no breath came out. I only remember collapsing, unable to comprehend that my son was dead. At that instant, the world stopped spinning for me. When I opened my eyes, I knew I was in the town health center. My throat felt closed, as if I had screamed until I lost my voice. Around me, a nurse and a neighbor were trying to calm me down. They explained that I had fainted next to Mateo's little body. My memories were confused, but the image of my lifeless son remained nailed into my mind, accompanied by the deepest pain I have ever felt. I got up clumsily, looking for Cassandra or someone to tell me where Adrian was. No one wanted to give details at first. I suppose they feared my reaction would be even worse. But I needed to know what was happening. Finally, one of the nurses told me that the police had taken Adrian away, accusing him of the murder of our baby. Apparently, when the agents arrived, they found him in a state of crisis, clinging to Mateo's body and muttering nonsense. He resisted arrest, and that's why they beat him. The rest was chaos. I couldn't even shed tears at that moment. It was as if my soul had been dried up. I reacted by asking to see my boy. They told me the body had already been taken to the morgue for the required autopsy. It was a brutal blow, but at the same time, I realized my life had changed forever and that I had matters to attend to. I wanted explanations, justice, and vengeance, all mixed up in my head. Even so, I had no strength for a formal complaint. I only felt a hole that grew larger with each passing minute. I spent that night at my in-laws' house. They were devastated, crying non-stop. Don Aurelio insisted he couldn't believe his own son had done something so atrocious. He said Adrian wasn't like that. Dona Marta, his wife, took my hand and, with a trembling voice, asked for my forgiveness in a way that disarmed me. I knew they weren't guilty, but seeing them so affected, I realized we had all lost Mateo. The next day, I went to the public prosecutor's office to give my statement. It was very heavy, narrating the details of the last months, how Adrian had behaved erratically and violently. Even so, the agents treated me coldly, as if they doubted every word. They asked for Mateo's birth certificate, documentation of the store, anything that would help them understand the family situation. I felt like running away, but I couldn't. I had to face reality. The investigation continued its course. I found out that a judge had ordered a psychiatric evaluation for Adrian, and in the end, they determined he was not fit to face a normal trial. He was transferred to a psychiatric hospital in the capital, where they would keep him under observation. That news left me in shock. I went from having a loving husband to a man who, according to the law, was mentally incapacitated and would not answer for the crime. Meanwhile, Mateo's funeral was a very sad ceremony. Only my closest relatives and some compassionate neighbors attended. Other people preferred to stay away, perhaps for fear of the bad luck that surrounded us. There were prayers and crying, but I could barely concentrate. I felt my mind floating in a void of pain. After burying him, I stayed alone for a while in the cemetery, caressing the small wooden cross we placed on his grave. It still smelled of fresh paint. My body trembled thinking about all the joy that child had brought and how it vanished in an instant. I returned to the house, where I found Cassandra gathering the remnants of merchandise still in the store. Everything was upside down, broken containers, the cash register open with no money, and a sepulchral silence. She hugged me tightly and told me we had to decide what to do with the property. I didn't want to think about it, but it was evident I couldn't continue living there. It was a cursed place for me. The memory of Mateo and the blood on the floor tormented me day and night. I put the store up for sale at a very low price, even knowing that because of what happened, no one would want to buy it. I just wanted to get far away. In the midst of my grief, I returned to Dona Yolanda, the healer who had given me the amulets. I wanted to know if she could do something to ease my spirit, or at least guide me. When she saw me arrive, I perceived sadness in her eyes. She invited me to sit down and served me some coffee from a clay pot. Without beating around the bush, I told her about the tragedy. She sighed and remained silent for a while. Then she said, "I felt something very bad was surrounding you, child. I'm so sorry. Sometimes the evil is so strong that a single cleansing isn't enough to contain it." She gave me advice that resonated within me: pray for my child's soul and try to break the hatred I myself felt, because according to her, a curse also feeds on the victim's negative emotions. If one fills up with rage and anger, that dark energy grows stronger. It seemed hard to believe, but I understood that the pain was turning into ira inside me. She offered me a second cleansing, this time focused on freeing myself from resentments. I accepted, desperate to find some peace amidst the chaos. The ceremony was more intense than the first. She used branches of pepper tree, white candles, and strange prayers in a dialect I didn't recognize. At the end, she gave me another, smaller amulet for me to carry always, and she recommended that I not let fear rule my life. Paying her with money didn't seem right, so I gave her some groceries and a small amount of cash I had. She took it without protest, blessed me one last time, and wished me a better destiny. Days later, I found out that Dona Clara, the woman we suspected might have done the witchcraft, was found dead under gruesome circumstances. Her own son, Camillo, killed her, beating her with a hammer, according to neighbors. The boy had an attack of madness while he was drugged. It was such a brutal event that the whole town was shocked. Some said it was all part of karma, or the evil she had sown coming back. Others swore Camillo was possessed. I couldn't feel any joy from that news. Her misfortune didn't repair mine, nor did it bring Mateo back. Meanwhile, the paperwork to sell the house was moving slowly. Some came only out of morbid curiosity, to see the place where the baby died, then left with horrified expressions and said they weren't interested. Until an outsider businessman, who bought cheap properties to remodel and resell, accepted the deal. The price was a joke, less than half of what it cost to build and equip, but I had no choice. I needed to get away from there, to try to flee the memories. With that money, I settled in the house of some distant relatives near the Oaxacan coast. It was a modest, almost abandoned dwelling where they offered to let me stay in exchange for making repairs. I wanted a place where no one knew me or my story. There, I tried to rebuild my life, although the process was slow and painful. The nights became my worst torment, full of nightmares where I heard my sons crying and Adrian's insane screams. Adrian's family sometimes sent me messages, telling me he remained institutionalized under psychiatric treatment. Apparently, he had episodes of lucidity where he asked about me and cried for what he had done, then fell back into a state of confusion. They didn't know what to expect from his future. I didn't dare visit him. I didn't feel capable of being face to face with the man who took my child's life. My wound was too deep. As the months passed, people somewhat forgot the story. The store was remodeled and would one day open under another name, I suppose. In the region, some still talked about me, saying I was cursed, that my son had died by divine punishment or because of witches. One learns quickly how cruel gossip can be. That's why whenever I heard a rumor, I distanced myself, trying not to get caught up in that negativity. In the house near the coast, I started planting corn and raising a few chickens. It was like starting over from zero. I spent a lot of time in silence, thinking about Mateo, about how he would have grown up, and that none of this would have happened. Sometimes I was overcome by crying, and other days I was filled with fury against Adrian and against whoever cast that witchcraft on us. However, I remembered Dona Yolanda's words about not feeding the darkness with hatred. I clung to faith as best I could, asking God to give me strength not to go crazy. Then, one good day, I received a visit from Cassandra. She came by bus, crossing hills and roads to find me. She told me Adrian had shown apparent improvement, he no longer screamed like before and remembered some things more clearly. The doctor said his condition was complicated but could be treated with medication for his whole life. She asked me if I didn't want to see him, if only to try for emotional closure. I hesitated. What would I say to the man who took the most valuable thing I had? Cassandra insisted, saying Adrian repeated my name, repentant. According to him, something diabolical took over his mind and made him commit the worst possible act. I felt a huge contradiction. Part of me wanted to believe him. Another part screamed that there would be no forgiveness. However, I also understood that my hatred was poisoning me. It was very hard to make a decision, but I agreed to travel with her to the capital where he was interned. The journey was tense. My stomach churned, my mind raced ahead to the scene of seeing him. Upon arriving at the hospital, the smell of disinfectant and the gray doors made me incredibly nervous. Cassandra spoke with the staff, and some nurses guided us to the room where Adrian was. I saw him sitting on a metal bench, his face gaunt, his gaze lost. He had an unkempt beard and deep dark circles under his eyes. When I approached, he blinked a couple of times and then looked down, as if unsure I was real. I sat down next to him, trembling. He looked at me with eyes full of pain and said in a low voice, "Forgive me, Rosario. I swear I don't know how it happened. It wasn't me." His voice broke. I felt a stab in my chest. I wanted to scream at him, to demand he account for destroying my life and our son's, but I couldn't. I just looked at him in silence and noticed he still had those nervous reactions, like spasms, every moment. It was evident something was very wrong with his mind, that his sanity had fallen into a dark well. A mix of pity and rage washed over me. Still, I remembered Dona Yolanda's words. I took a deep breath and, with my voice restrained, told him I wanted to understand what happened. He tried to explain, repeating that he felt a presence chasing him, that he heard voices whispering that the world was ending and Mateo was in danger. Finally, in tears, he confessed that one night he dreamed of a woman who forced him to free our child, to get him out of this earthly hell. When he woke up, he could no longer distinguish reality from the dream. That was when he committed the atrocity that destroyed us. As absurd as it sounded, I felt a chill because it coincided with my nightmares about the female shadow entering the room. I didn't know if it was all a shared delusion or if someone had actually used witchcraft against us. The only clear thing was that there was no going back. Mateo would not return to life. We said goodbye, not knowing if I would visit him again. Adrian stayed seated with his head in his hands, murmuring something about forgiveness and sin. Cassandra's gaze, full of tears, told me she was also broken. Before I left, a doctor approached and commented that Adrian's condition was delicate, that he might never be the same again. I nodded silently. What else could I do? I returned to my refuge on the coast, trying to digest what I had experienced. At night, I had trouble sleeping, and when I did, I dreamed of Mateo's laughter. Upon waking, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. However, something in that visit allowed me to release a little of the resentment I carried, even without being able to forgive him. I understood that Adrian was another victim of that darkness, be it witchcraft or mental illness. The following months passed without major surprises. I worked the land, sold a couple of sheep, and managed as best I could. I avoided contact with most of my acquaintances from the town because calls only brought back memories that hurt me. Slowly, life began to establish a gray but tolerable routine. One day, I received a letter from a distant relative living in Veracruz. He told me there were job opportunities in a restaurant. I thought about taking the offer to change scenery again, even though it meant a long trip. I was ready for anything that would help me feel alive again. At the same time, I also considered seeing Dona Yolanda again before leaving, to make sure there were no loose ends or spiritual threats I was dragging along. Time had taught me that even if you flee, the shadows of the past can follow you if you don't close the circle properly. I debated between staying, going to Veracruz, or even returning to the capital to see if the situation improved. A voice in my mind reminded me of the cruelty of witchcraft, envy, and hatred. I didn't want anything like that to happen again, but I also feared facing that world of cleansings and curses again, which churned my stomach with fear. Little did I imagine that, in the midst of this indecision, life had a final chapter in store for me that would confirm my suspicions about the destructive reach of that dark force that devastated my family. I still had to learn that sometimes, those responsible for the tragedy pay such a high price that it's almost impossible to believe. I hesitated a lot before deciding to return to Dona Yolanda. Almost a year had passed since the tragedy, and although I still mourned my son Mateo, I felt the need to close that cycle. My life in that coastal refuge had become so routine that at times I thought everything I lived through was a terrible dream. But every time I remembered Adrian's gaunt face or my child's cold little body, my heart clenched. Finally, one Sunday morning, I packed a small bag and boarded a little truck heading to the area where Yolanda lived. Along the way, I contemplated the arid landscape of the hills and the intense blue sky. During the trip, uncertainty invaded me. Why was I going to see her again? Perhaps I needed understanding, maybe I longed to know if any trace of the evil that devastated us still existed. I arrived in the afternoon at the healer's house. I found her grinding corn on a stone metate. Upon seeing me, she stopped what she was doing and received me with a warm hug. She invited me to sit in the kitchen, just like the first time. The smell of herbs and coffee transported me back to the memory of when she gave me the first amulet. I thought about that illusion I had that everything could be fixed. I realized how much I had changed. I told Yolanda that I was about to leave for Veracruz with some relatives who were offering me work. I want to know if I'm carrying something dark, I said. Her eyes rested on me seriously, and she replied in her calm voice, "You've been through hell, child, and it's natural to fear that shadow might follow you. But sometimes, to move forward, you have to let go of fear, forgive, and leave with a free heart. She asked me to accompany her to a small altar she had in a back room. It was decorated with candles, saints, and a bunch of dried flowers. Before starting, she took a glass of water with a touch of liquor, brought it close to me, and told me to take a sip. Then she lit 2 candles and prayed softly. I felt a slight dizziness and a tingling all down my back, as if something moved inside me. It was intense but brief, and then she blew on the flame, extinguishing it with a whisper. "You are clean," she said. "What you carry now is your pain, not a spell. And that pain is not removed with cleansings, but with time and the will to continue with your life." Her words calmed me. I asked her if she was sure there was no curse or influence left that could follow me. Yolanda shook her head and added, "That witchcraft they cast on you was very strong, but it has already taken its price. The one who provoked it died horribly, and your husband was driven mad. Nothing remains but your own healing." Back in the city, I thought about going to the psychiatric hospital to see Adrian one last time before leaving for Veracruz. I wasn't sure I wanted to relive that pain, but something pushed me to do it. Maybe I was seeking definitive closure. I arrived near nightfall. The white lights of the building and the smell of disinfectant churned my stomach. I explained to the receptionist that I wanted to visit Adrian. She made a face, checked some papers, and told me to wait. Several minutes passed until a doctor with a serious expression came out. He asked about my relationship to Adrian. I explained we were spouses, although I hadn't visited in a long time. The doctor sighed and gave me the news bluntly. "I'm afraid your husband passed away a few days ago." I felt the floor move beneath my feet. I didn't expect that. The doctor continued speaking. "About a week ago, he entered a very strong crisis. He screamed and banged his head against the walls. We had to sedate him. His condition worsened, and he eventually collapsed. Officially, it was reported as cardiac arrest." I stood still, not knowing how to react. I had lost my son and now my husband in less than a year. Although he had caused me irreparable pain, he was also the man with whom I built dreams and had Mateo. Knowing he died in the midst of a crisis provoked a feeling of pity and rage against misfortune in me. I could barely articulate a word. The doctor offered his condolences, handed me a small bag with Adrian's few belongings, and left. Inside the bag, I found a plastic crucifix and 2 crumpled letters. One looked like a child's drawing, formless. The other had a few phrases written by hand in trembling handwriting, barely legible. "Forgive me, I didn't know what I did. Mateo, Rosario, hell chases me." Several words were illegible, as if his coherence had run out. That note broke my heart. Despite everything, I felt compassion for him. He died wrapped in the same madness that made him take our child's life. That night I returned aimlessly to the boarding house where I was staying. I barely slept. I sat staring at those letters, crying silently. In the morning, I made the decision to go again to the cemetery in my town to leave those things by Mateo's grave. Maybe it sounded absurd, but I felt that way I would close the circle. I didn't want to carry Adrian's belongings, even though it hurt me to know he was my husband. I arrived at the cemetery at noon. The sun was beating down hard, and the wind raised dust over the graves. I found my child's. The wooden cross was still there, though showing signs of wear. I placed the letter and the crucifix in a small box, buried it at the foot of the cross, and prayed. I didn't pray only for Adrian or Mateo. I prayed for myself, for my healing, for everything that had been lost. After that moment of farewell, I felt a strange peace. It wasn't total relief yet, but I felt that somehow I had released a burden that wouldn't let me breathe. I understood that I no longer wished to curse Adrian. He was both victim and victimizer. His end confirmed to me that the horror we lived through did not leave him unpunished. I decided to go to my parents' house to spend a few days with them before leaving for Veracruz. They received me with hugs and hot food. Although we didn't talk much about the subject, I noticed the concern in their eyes, as if they feared I too would lose my sanity. That week, I spent helping my mother with house chores and talking with my father about simple things like the weather or the price of corn. It felt strange trying to normalize things amidst so much accumulated pain, but it did me good. The day before my trip, I had a final encounter with someone from the town. A neighbor who knew Camillo, Donna Clara's son, approached to tell me that he remained locked up in a high-security prison and that his situation was terrible. Apparently, he showed signs of severe mental disorders. Part of me shuddered, feeling that everything related to that witchcraft had ended in madness and death. It was as if a sinister force had dragged all involved to tragic fates. That night I slept in my old childhood room and dreamed of Matteo. I saw him running barefoot down a dirt road, laughing happily, without any danger. I felt at peace. Upon waking, I knew it was the farewell I needed. I took a bus to Veracruz, leaving behind the Oaxacan hills where I grew up and where I also lived the worst nightmare of my life. It wasn't easy, but I felt that trip represented a new beginning, far from the shadow that consumed us. Upon arrival, I settled into my relative's house, a simple but clean space near the coast. They received me warmly and offered me a job in the family restaurant. During the first few days, I felt strange, waiting tables and listening to diners talk about their everyday affairs as if the world's tragedies didn't exist. Little by little, I got used to it. I clung to the routine of getting up early, cooking, serving customers, cleaning. Sometimes, when the workday ended, I would go for a walk on the beach, contemplating the vastness of the sea, and find some comfort. Months passed, and every so often melancholy would invade me when I remembered Matteo. There were nights I cried hugging my pillow, remembering his smiling little face. Other times I woke up sweating, afraid of seeing again the shadow approaching my son. But I repeated to myself that the darkness was no longer in my life. What remained was a grief that would perhaps take the rest of my days. With my relative's trust, I managed to save some money. I thought about the possibility of opening a small stand or a little Mexican snack shop, this time without giving credit, without opening up to ill-intentioned people. However, I was afraid to stand out or prosper. I had the fear that someone's envy would rekindle the curse. I debated internally, remembering the healer's advice: one cannot live tied to fear. If you do, you end up a prisoner of a ghost. One afternoon, my relatives suggested I buy a sea amulet, a shell, or a handmade necklace as symbolic protection. It seemed like a good idea. I went to the boardwalk where some artisans sold necklaces with shells and stones. I chose a simple one with a small carved shell and hung it around my neck. I felt a slight relief, as if with that act I sealed a personal pact to start anew, without forgetting my past but without giving room to resentment. Some time later, I gathered the courage to write my story in a notebook. I sat under the light of a lamp and, page after page, told everything: Adrian's arrival in my life, Matteo's birth, the store, the witchcraft, my husband's transformation, my son's death, Adrian's confinement, and his final departure. It was a raw account, without adornments. When I finished, I realized I needed to share it with someone beyond my close circle, perhaps as a warning of what can happen when envy and dark arts enter a home. Thus arose the idea of this written testimony, to share with certain acquaintances and forums where people tell their paranormal or horror stories, not to draw attention, but so that others are alert and value their family. I learned that a prosperous business can attract the greed of people full of hatred, and that witchcraft is not always seen as a myth or a silly superstition. There can be forces that somehow feed on our own fragility. Today, as I finish this story, I live on the Veracruz coast and strive to be brave. The memory of Matteo remains alive in my heart. Sometimes in my dreams, I see him running along a blue beach, laughing without a care. I prefer that dream to the nightmare that tormented me before. I no longer have resentment towards Adrian. What happened was so cruel that it escapes my understanding. If one day I am blessed to fall in love again or start a family, I know I will carry the scars of this experience with me, but at the same time, I will have more caution and protect myself from those who feign friendship but harbor rancor or envy inside. For those who read this account, don't live in fear, but don't forget to protect yourselves. Sometimes, discretion, an amulet, faith, or the firmness to not let envious people into your space is enough. And if something dark still appears, seek help without hesitation. Don't let evil advance as far as it did in my case. I survived, but it cost me my family and the dreams we had built.